So, thanks for being here. My name's Stewart Desson from Lumina Learning, and I'm going to present on behalf of myself and my three colleagues, Professors Golding, Towle and Benton, on some validity work around the Lumina Spark model. I'm going to give you some context on the model and then talk about this particular bit of research, the purpose, the design, a few hypotheses that we've tested, and then there may be time for 30 seconds of discussion at the end. So this is the four-factor version of the Lumina Spark model. So it's not including neuroticism. And typically what we do is measure conscientiousness and measure openness. But in this model, we measure both ends. So for example, extroversion, we measure extroversion. We have separate items to measure introversion. And these are the traits underneath. So we're measuring it at both ends. And this links as well to the concept of beta and plasticity. These are the ones that correlate here. All these different aspects correlate quite nicely into the two higher order factors. Putting it into a circular model, the other thing that we do is, as well as measuring both ends, we separate out adaptive traits from maladaptive traits. So all the traits on here have been measured in a way that's likely to correlate positively with performance at work, and there are 24 traits around here. But equally in the instrument, we also measure maladaptive traits. So if you look at the words around the outside, so now extroversion becomes controlling or overbearing under pressure, and introversion becomes serious and withdrawn. So a couple of questions. So why would we measure both ends? And why measure adaptive? Why measure maladaptive? Why separate these things out? Well, three answers. We want to mitigate any evaluative bias. We want to improve the criterion validity by going to a more detailed level. And we want to as well value different ways of being in the workplace, so we don't overvalue, let's say, extroversion versus introversion. So if we look at the TDA, you'll find that extroverted qualities, the extroverted adjectives, are generally pretty positive, bold, verbal, daring, active, but the introverted ones, not so. If I ask my kids which would they prefer out of these, they think these seem to be more attractive, irrespective of what their real personality is. So Peterson came up with this really nice paper back in 2014, when an evaluatively unbalanced set of descriptors, such as the big five adjectival markers, is subjected to a simple structure rotation algorithm, the resulting factors almost invariably end up contrasting positive versus negative descriptors. So this is something that has been looked at, and Peterson recommends looking at the valence of an item and consider the descriptive content as two separate things that are going on when we assess an item. So what does that mean in practical terms? Here's an adaptive extroverted item, I'm a cheerful optimist. And here's a maladaptive introverted one. I sometimes fail to assert myself as much as I could. And the solution, well, it's to measure things at both ends. So Peterson suggests, in this questionnaire he worked on, does things without thinking, doesn't plan ahead, could be split into measuring maladaptive at both ends. And this would look at, would help remove some of the bias. So we're actually splitting adaptive into two bits of adaptive. This is the underlying adaptive in the instrument measured by things that we enjoy, prefer, we gravitate to. And then we can have adaptive, which is more our actual behaviour, where we're tuning up, tuning down. We're all here at the conference, so we're tuning up certain behaviour. Some of us are tuning up our extroversion to be here. And we can have maladaptive or overextended behaviours as well. In terms of the items, just to give you an example, underlying, everyday, overextended, this is collaborative. I tend to be naturally trusting of others, an underlying collaborative measure. I always acknowledge the contribution of others every day. I spend too much time supporting others, I can lose sight of my own needs. That's the overextended version. But we can look at the opposite, being competitive. Winning's important to me, underlying, and so on. You get the idea. We can measure both at both ends, adaptively and maladaptively, and this is an example of some data where somebody could be collaborative and competitive. They're not necessarily opposites for everybody. So in this research, we want to test, is this adaptive, maladaptive approach, will it show differential validity when we look at 360 performance? And how does this link with the 24 personality predictors against the Great 8? So the design methodology, 168 professionals. They filled in the 4-factor version of Lumina Spark, adaptively, maladaptively. They also got 360 feedback from peers, staff, and so on. And we were measuring the underlying everyday overextended, 72 measures in total. It is a fairly small sample size, so there are some limitations on how much we can generalize. So we had some hypotheses that more positive than negative correlations would exist for the adaptive traits, and more negative ones would exist for the maladaptive. We also thought from the literature that conscientiousness, or discipline driven in this model, would correlate well with delivering results in the Great 8, and also against total performance. Total performance was measured by adding up all 8 of the Great 8 competencies into one total performance measure. And we also thought or hypothesized that the opposite of conscientiousness, inspiration driven, being a bit random, seizing the moment, going with the flow, breaking a few rules, we thought that might correlate negatively with delivering results and total performance. And finally, we hypothesized that across all 8 of the aspects in the Spark model, there would be at least one trait that correlates positively with some aspect of the Great 8. Here's some of the results. So I won't go through it line by line, but I will show you just the ones that are statistically significant. So indeed, this is total performance. We do get conscientiousness coming through, and this is underlying persona. So this is how people enjoy behaving, their preference. Conscientiousness comes through as agreeableness, collaborative, with a little bit of extroversion in some of the numbers here. But quite an interesting mix with some positives and some negatives. So if we flick through now and have a look at the everyday, and I just show you the ones that are most significant, we find, for example, competitive is correlating well at the far end with driving performance, and tough is helping us to deliver results. But logical here is stopping us relate to people. And if we go to our overextended, so this is where we've measured too much of a good thing and correlated it with our Great 8 performance, we're expecting more negative correlations. We do indeed find in this middle cluster here, disagreeableness is hitting our performance, particularly around the people-related competencies, such as relating to people and respecting people. There's some negative correlations there. But even conscientiousness, if we overplay it, is going to get in the way of us creating concepts and so on. So let's have a look at the hypotheses. We found indeed that the underlying traits did correlate more positively. So 25 were significantly positive versus 8. For every day, it was 31 versus 12. And indeed, for the overextended, there were much more negative correlations. 23 of the correlations were negative, but still 9 were positive. That's a pretty interesting finding. For example, in the data, people who were very demonstrative and animated, and under pressure they become control freaks and drivers. People seem to give them good feedback at getting things done in this particular sample. So it's not always that something that's overextended is necessarily bad for your performance, at least in the eyes of the feedback group. So we also looked at conscientiousness, discipline driven, and said this will correlate with performance, and we did accept that hypothesis. So purposeful, structured, reliable, all correlated well, the underlying and the everyday, with delivering results from the Great 8. But we rejected it at the total performance level. We only had one correlation from purposeful underlying linking to total performance. And if we have a look at the overextended for inspiration driven, we partly accept that overplaying your inspiration and being impulsive can get in the way. Going with the flow too much, that wasn't a problem, but being too flexible, breaking the rules, or being too spontaneous, that was getting in the way of delivering results. But it didn't seem to be affecting overall performance. The final hypothesis to test was that going around all of these 8 aspects, they'd have something that correlates with some aspect of the Great 8 positively. So we'll start at the big picture thinking. This is openness, and indeed there were good correlations there with the Great 8 for all 3 of them. Down to earth, just the caution bit of down to earth helped with delivery. With extroversion, being sociable, demonstrative and taking charge seemed to help. demonstrative even overextended, although sociable not so. Introversion, we didn't in this study come up with any introverted qualities that drove performance. Although I have to say, in other studies on leaders, we have found that, so that merits a bit more investigation. Outcome focused did indeed correlate with performance, as did people focused. And finally, discipline driven was one of the stronger ones, but we did find some good correlations for inspiration driven as well. So I hope you find that interesting, the idea of having a balanced model that measures both ends and looking for the correlations at this more detailed level. A couple of references, a couple of conclusions that I've come to. So many aspects of personality, even when you measure the low end you wouldn't normally measure, if you look carefully you will find some positive correlations with performance. And that measuring both ends can mitigate the risk of an evaluative bias. In terms of future research, neuroticism is a really rich field to look at, and we have already got some initial research that looking at what is the adaptive bit of being neurotic. People don't normally look at that, but there are some helpful correlations with performance at work through being vigilant and so on. There are some curvilinear relationships here that are worth looking at. And the bandwidth fidelity argument, there's lots to look at in that around this sort of rich data. So that's everything I wanted to say. I think I'm on time, just about. Have we got time for 30 seconds of questions?
20 seconds.
20 seconds of questions. Any questions? We're done. Okay, thank you.